Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. A little over a decade ago, I got a pretty interesting offer. Sometimes I've had some really exciting journalistic assignments in my life, and this one was to go up to Seattle and profile a most mysterious band known as the Sun City Girls. And I have to admit that I had some trepidation because the Sun City Girls were known for not necessarily giving that many chats and sometimes cultivating outright hostility and certainly bafflement in relationship to their audience. They emerged out of the punk scene in Arizona in the late 1970s, but soon began to include all sorts of music and attitudes, beat poetry, jazz, surf music, exotica, African sounds, Middle Eastern sounds into their mix, which often didn't really please the punk rock audiences very much. But the Sun City Girls did not care because they blazed perhaps the most singular, anti-authoritarian, omnivorously eclectic and consistently surprising and bizarre career in the history of American underground music. So needless to say, I was slightly disturbed, but found Alan and Richard Bishop, two of the three members of the band, to be very, very accessible. I only spoke with Charlie, the drummer, a little bit, and Charlie passed away in 2007. And that was when the band Sun City Girls dissolved into the nowness of it all. And one of the things about their records, though, that always intrigued me and that I didn't really know what to expect was that they dipped rather mightily in terms of imagery, titles, and an overall ambiance into esoterica, into the mysteries, into the occult, witchcraft, strange, exotic deities, Orientalism, a sort of mishmash that ran from exploitation obsessions to clearly very deeply felt transmissions of some nebulous occult order that I was never very clear of. I mean, even the titles of their records made it very clear. Things like Torch of the Mystics, Valentine's from Matahari, and my favorite, 330,003 cross-dressers from Beyond the Rig Veda. There was a kind of talismanic force to a lot of their records, and many of the tunes would stretch out into these epic, psychedelic, transformative, exotic, bizarre, cosmic wanderings. And then, the next track would be a scatological humor piece, and, the next one's a punk rock screamer. And it was really quite a mix. And I discovered that everyone was interested in esoterica, but particularly the guitarist Richard Bishop, who's been known as Sir Richard Bishop as a solo artist for a little over a decade now. And his amazing guitar work. I mean, one of my favorite guitarists, living or dead, partly because of the way in which he combines very many different styles and languages and aesthetic approaches into something that doesn't become like a fusion mix, like a lot of people who try to draw from different traditions, where it's just this kind of glazed, lumpy oatmeal of sameness. Instead, he has each track on his records is like a different exotic world that's opening up, and some of them are ferocious, and some of them are sublime, and some of them are sad, and some of them are very funny and devilishly mischievous. And so his own work has this kind of ambiance of esoterica in it. But Richard is also a rare book dealer, an antiquarian book dealer who's been focusing on magic, witchcraft, alchemy, esoterica, a little bit of erotica, some exotica materials for quite some time. And like a lot of musicians, Richard has been interviewed far more times than he ever wants to think about. in regards to his music. And so I wanted to get him on the show, and I promised that we'd mostly talk about books, which to me is interesting a topic, and one that we've come back to a number of times on Expanding Mind, talking to esoteric book dealers and collectors. We talked to Todd Pradham just a couple of months ago, and an amazing book dealer, great catalog writer, and Richard is no slouch as well. So I'm very happy to invite Richard onto Expanding Mind. Thanks for joining us.
I am here.
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, I was just saying the trolls and the gremlins were getting on us for that, but so apologies.
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you, and then all of a sudden you cut out, and it sounded like you were saying some very nice things, and I hope that was the case.
Yeah. I kept the insults for later when I had to fill up the dead air. But we'll edit those out.
I've got a list of those too, Eric. I got plenty of insults too.
Excellent. Yeah. So as I was saying, we're going to talk about books. I had a wonderful time this morning going through your recent listings, and one of the reasons I started to get into esoteric books and the kind of collector world was, it took a while for me to really sort of become a collector of myself, and I still keep it reasonably under control. But for a long time, back in the 90s, the same time when I was ordering Sun City Girls cassettes, I have a few of those rare and cherished items. I was also getting Todd Pradham's catalog and, reading the lists of these and descriptions of these books kind of filled my heart with this sense of possibility and strangeness, that the world was not as dull and dry as it appears a lot of the time. So there's just something about esoteric books in particular, regardless of their content and whether you believe it or you don't believe it, but there's something about the space itself that's very attractive. But I know you didn't start out with the esoteric books as your main antiquarian focus, right?
Well, not yes and no, actually. Not as a bookseller. I mean, I started out as a collector early with esoteric stuff. Now, this goes back to the early to mid 80s, where back then good esoteric books were hard to find, and I just kind of stumbled onto it. I had this interest early on in ancient Egypt for whatever reason. So early on, I had a few books that I had picked up, the Dover reprints of Budge's Gods of the Egyptians and the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And this was probably when I was about 20. And it wasn't until a few years later where, I heard about, the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley and there was an incident or an instance, I guess, in Phoenix early on where there was this group of people who were musicians. They played like industrial music, and they were, kind of dark at the time. And in fact, me and my friends, we called these people the darkies. I mean, and I don't mean any slurs by that, but because they were mysterious and they were kind of scary at first. And it turns out that one of these guys eventually had me over and gave me a tarot card reading, and it was with the Crowley tarot deck, and it was very dramatic. And he had a copy of the little red copy of the Book of the Law next to it, and he gave me this tarot reading, and for some reason it was just 100% spot on for whatever reason. And I asked, and he had the Crowley's Book of Thoth there, and I asked him afterwards, can I look at that? Can I touch that book? Because it had that cool cover, and it was battered, and he finally gave me a copy. And once I started reading that, and because there's plenty of Egyptian references in that, that kind of got me interested. That, along with the fact that the tarot reading was kind of uncanny for a young 22-year-old or however old I was at the time. And that is what made me start to get interested in, something a little more than your basic Egyptology. And it turned out that with this friend of mine and a couple other friends, we started trying to gather books, Crowley books, Golden Dawn, Israel Regardie, who lived in Arizona at the time, and it was very difficult because there obviously wasn't an internet then. There was one metaphysical shop in Phoenix, and it was oddly enough called the Metaphysical Shop. And occasionally he would get some Crowley books, but mostly it was Sedona and Crystal, this and that, and some New Agey stuff. So it became this contest between our friends to see who could get these books, and it was very difficult, but we eventually formed a study group with the 3 or 4 people and, studied the Golden Dawn stuff, and we kind of ventured into the Crowley. It was a little foreign at the time, whereas the Golden Dawn stuff seemed more legitimate. It was reasonable, and it all made sense, whereas the other stuff was a little further out at that time. And so that's when I first started collecting books or trying to collect books, and I would even sell a book every now and then to maybe get, a better book. That's just how you had to do it back then, without really the idea of being a bookseller or anything. But the more books you got, the more you wanted. And I remember specifically, we eventually started reading some Kenneth Grant, which was, way beyond what we had been reading. And that seemed to be the prize. If we could find these books by Kenneth Grant, then, we're good to go. We're ahead of the curve. And we just couldn't find them. We just couldn't find them back then. It was very difficult.
Funny. One of my great regrets was that there was I was in Trinidad, and walking down a city street, and there was this crazy old guy who tried to sell me The Night Side of Eden, this Kenneth Grant book, like this, from this crazy Rastafarian looking dude in Trinidad, and he wanted too much for it, and I realized it was going to be a gnarly haggle, and so I just avoided it. But in retrospect, I was like, man, you should have paid top dollar for that. Who cares? It's amazing, that sense of when you would stumble across those books, and also just the whole, for younger people listening to this, they might have never been in a metaphysical bookstore, and in the wake of the counterculture and then sort of the spiritual interest in Eastern wisdom and all that, you'd have these metaphysical bookstores, and some went back farther, like the one in San Francisco Fields that I haunted for so long, went back to the 30s. Yeah. And they were almost, every major cosmopolitan area usually had one, and sometimes they were more new agey, and sometimes they were more deep and dark. But it was really like a whole zone, a way of finding your way through the 80s, where you'd find the one shop in the town, and there was a sort of an energy clustered around it, and people would put flyers up, and again, it was that sense of possibility in the midst of our kind of banal modern American landscape that was so attractive.
Yeah, and that was just how it was then. I remember specifically again in Phoenix, there was eventually you just couldn't find any more books. You had to either, you exhausted the local bookshop, and then you had to try to play the catalog game or get on the phone and call dealers cold and say, hey, you got any books by Kenneth Grant? And, they don't know what you're talking about because they weren't metaphysical dealers necessarily. And then finally, there was another store that we found in Phoenix. It was called the Royal Bookstore, and this guy was a one-man operation. His big thing was smut, all levels of smut, whether it's sleeves, paperbacks, magazines of every kink and fetish you could imagine, and even some normal smut. But he would always somehow have a little shelf behind his desk of occult books. And so that became our new go-to guy. I said, well, this guy, I don't know where he's getting this stuff. But so he became our source for a little while. But then, you get everything they have, and then that's it. And so, where do you go from there? You just have to study yourself and try to start writing your own things. And that was never a good idea with me because I don't really do that. But it certainly has changed since then. But at the time, it was very limited for me anyway. I mean, I didn't have connections I didn't know much about Weiser back then or, Never got out of town too often to go look for books, but that was just the way it was.
Yeah, I mean, when you were talking about this, I'm remembering places that again in the 80s in Berkeley there was Shambhala. That's where I bought my Book of Thoth and studied diligently. And there was such a scene around Berkeley that had that kind of stuff. But the place that your discussion of, I can't remember the name of it, the one the smut shop. There was a store in New Haven where I was going to college called Book World. And Book World was a 24-hour bookstore, which already tells you something. And you could go in there, and there was there's some normal books. There was a lot of smut, and then there was like esoterica and psychedelic books and science fiction. So I bought a lot of my science fiction there, and I bought a lot of the esoterica there. But the dudes behind the counter, man, they were just from another world. They were like some mix of like D&D freak and pervy Uncle Herb or whatever. I mean, they were really, really, really characters, and that was part of what it was. Is that the occult and the esoterica, and this is, again, you can't see this now. The internet really changed what the underground was or is. I mean, I'm not even sure it exists anymore. But then the connections between esoterica or the occult and these other sort of undergrounds there was permeable. It was like once you got into the underground, then there was all these different ways you could go, but the whole thing was still kind of not really available or very visible in any obvious way.
Yeah, and but it's just not like that anymore, and it's the entire thing is different. Whether you're a collector or a bookseller, it's a changed game. It's going to continue to change, and but at least now we can find books whenever we need them. They're out there. That's just how it is.
Yeah, no, that's just how it is. And it's so funny when you think about you could have a lot of, economic discussions about how the book has changed with the internet and the rise of e-readers, blah, blah, blah. And, and even just the fact that it seems obvious that people aren't reading as many books, or at least people have more things competing for their attention. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the power of the book goes away. In fact, in some ways, it's more obvious. You can kind of tell the difference between a really nice, rare volume and the kind of energy it has, particularly if it's has an esoteric or magical theme, in my experience, or an imaginative kind of quality. The difference between that and all the stuff we're getting through screens is also really clear. So there must have been some kind of rebound around the sort of fetish of the book, if you will. Is that something that you've seen over the last decade or so?
Yeah, actually, like the last couple decades, especially in the occult publishing and things like that. I mean, right now there are so many great publishers who are, they're small publishers who are creating fantastic books, not just the content, but the quality and the bindings and things like that, which is just a nice, refreshing thing. It's you have, and I'm sure a lot of these publishers, like Scarlet Imprint and Ouroboros Press and Zoanon and Three Hands Press, and that are doing these finely bound, lovely books. A lot of care has been put into them. A lot of new scholars, young people writing new original material, which I think has really caught on. And, it's kind of amazing because now you have so many books being published, and, maybe 75% of it's actually good stuff. There's always going to be some droll in there, that's, not going to be appealing to maybe as many people, but these publishers are doing their thing. They're getting these books out there, and what they're doing is they're creating a new group of collectors for these new books. And you have these talismanic books that are supposedly, happening too with these deluxe editions. And that's a whole other conversation that we can have if you want. But so right now, there's not as many crappy paperbacks being made. There's kind of a renaissance of quality, lasting books that people can actually hold on to. You're not going to find on the internet, or on a screen. You're not going to be print on demands of any of these things. So they're objects that people want, and there's suddenly quite a demand for them. And I'm hoping this continues because it's making things more interesting for me as a bookseller to get people who are collecting the modern stuff to maybe get a little more interested in some of the older material as well. So I think it's just good for the book trade and for the occult book trade in particular. And so there's a lot happening that's not going to change, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree. I find it very heartening, and just as someone who's interested in the material, but also just in terms of how people culturally respond to the internet digital world. And I think it's a really that kind of refusal or about face, I think, is really key. But part of it really has to do with this core mystery that you alluded to, this idea of talismanic books. And if you go into the history of writing, of books, of literature in many cultures, probably all cultures that developed a literary tradition early enough on, there were these elements of magic to the book itself. Writing itself had magical power. Drawing images in books had magical powers. The books themselves became sacred, whether you're talking about the Holy Scriptures in the major traditions, or you're talking about magical traditions, or you're talking about tattoos in Thailand. There's something about inscription itself that has a lot about what magic is. Like if you go, what is magic? Whether you want to have an aesthetic answer or a sociological, anthropological answer or a mystical answer, whatever it is, part of it seems to involve exactly what's going on with making, enjoying, reading, and owning, to some extent, books.
That's true. You mentioned the old scriptures, and just the way I look at it is with the idea of this modern version of talismanic books. It's certainly not anything new, but in the old days, people copied books by hand. They made manuscripts. There's power in letters, in the written word, especially if it's in your own hand or something like that, and not just massively printed and over and over. But so that's always been a thing. Sometimes there's been books in the past that have been considered so powerful that they've been burned, by the church, because it's a portal to the devil or whatever. But there's always been this sense of this sacred object in the form of a written book, whether it's a manuscript, whether it's an old handwritten grimoire or whatever. So that idea has always been around. And what I like about this new phase of occult publishing, and when I say new, it's 20 or more years old. I think the first official, considered the modern rehash isn't the greatest word, but the modern thing of talismanic books, I think originated with Folger Limited. I think Robert Ansel Folger in I think like the early 90s. Like maybe 1992, I think. And I think that was an Austin Osman Spare book, Axiomata, and it was 2 books, and The Witch's Sabbath. And it was, I just remember, I've had a couple over the years, and they're beautiful books. And it's set up like an old Ace Double book. You'd read one half of it, and then you'd flip it over and read the other half. There's a French word for that. It escapes me right now. But I think that's considered the first modern talismanic book, at least it's thought to be. And oddly enough, that came out, I think, the first year where Andrew Chumley's Azulacia came out in a paperback form. And, of course, that was published by Zoanon, if I'm even pronouncing that right. And they went on to become also one of the major talismanic publishers. And, you know, a lot of the books including actual hand-drawn talismans. And so that's created this trend that's, you know, if you talk to people about it, a lot of people think it's a great thing. A lot of people think it's a bunch of crap, you know, like they don't, it's just, they usually say it's talismanic and, you know, it's a sales and marketing tool or things like that. And, you know, I certainly understand that viewpoint, but, you know, sometimes you can get one of these books and you can tell, you can feel it. Not in every case, but, you know, a lot of these books have passed through my desk, so to speak. And there are some where, you know, it's not a lot, but you can hold the book and there's something to it. And there's other times where, you know, you get one of these fantastically bound books that come with a talisman and maybe you don't feel anything right away. And I think that's because, you know, you have to engage with it. It's like a magic lamp. I mean, the genie's not going to come out unless you rub the bottle or whatever. You know, it's you have to engage yourself with this, and maybe something will happen. But like I said, there's so many publishers doing it now, and it's become a thing, so to speak. And I don't think it's going away. And in fact, I hope it doesn't, because I think it sets an interesting precedent for future book publishing, not just occult books, but, you know, any type of book compared to what you can get now if you go down to your local Amazon shop or whatever, you know, your Barnes and Noble. You know, it's not going to be the same kind of thing. But there is the school of people who think that maybe a lot of this, like I said, is more of a sales pitch, you know. Like they don't believe that these books are intended to be talismans or spirit houses or however you want to look at it. And it's because a lot of the publishers won't really say what the process is, and I can respect that as well. But over the years, there's only been a few books that I've handled where immediately it's like, okay, I'm going to set this down for a second, because, you know, you just can tell that there's something going on here. And the first one I remember is I was selling this book for a client back in the 90s, and it was a copy of, oddly enough, it was a copy of the Book of Thoth by Crowley, but it was the one that came out in 1944, bound by the OTO, and just this beautiful binding, and signed and numbered by Uncle Al himself, so to speak. When I was holding this book, the thing was just, it was alive. And I don't think it was alive because it had Crowley's signature or anything like that, because I've handled other books with his signature, and it's like holding a dead fish. But this one, just, you could tell it had been used in a temple or in some ritual sense. It was just something about not just the content, it was just the feel of the book. There was something in the book. There was no doubt about it in my mind. And that's always stuck with me. And this was before I had heard anything about the idea of talismanic books. In fact, this is all pretty recent to me within the last several years. But the only time it's happened since then is with a more modern book, came out 3 years ago, maybe a little longer. It's called The Scorpion God. Now, any collector of modern occult books probably knows about Mark Allen Smith and his Primal Craft and his Trident of Witchcraft. And, it can be some interesting subject matter. But I had one of these deluxe editions from him. In fact, I had the first three. There was a trilogy. I had the Queen of Hell, and then the Red King, and the Scorpion God. And I read the first two, without a doubt, in the deluxe editions. And I had no problems, wasn't really into the material going into it as much but I have to, if I'm going to sell these, I have to know what the hell they're about. And so I went through them without any problems. The information kind of resonated a little bit with me. It took me a little while to get through the first two, but then I had the third one, the Scorpion God. And I'll tell you, when I started trying to read that, it's going to sound crazy, but it almost just wouldn't let me open the book. It's just like, no, not yet. You're not, this one, you just don't open it, And I kind of was like that. And it was like, well, that's interesting. But then I found a trade edition of the same book, had no problem with it. So it was something about that particular copy that interested me because of that. And so I started doing a little more research on Mark Allen Smith, who's the author. And, he's one of the few guys that really will tell you exactly what he does to make his books talismanic. And it's quite detailed. And I think that's kind of cool. He'll say, well, all the ink that we use and all the pens and all the tools, they're all ritually consecrated. The ink I use to sign the deluxe editions are mixed with my own blood and ritual possession. And he'll just go down the list. And I thought, well, if that's true, he's just putting it all out there. And because I had one experience with only one copy of his books, I'm going to say he's a man of his word, because I could tell there was something going on. But
it's so funny when I'm hearing about this. What's so strange about it is, and you pointed out yourself, is that you can simultaneously talk about this as this recovery, renewal of a certain ancient way of approaching material inscription in books and charging it with ritual energy and turning them into talismans. And at the same time, you can go, yeah, it's a good gimmick. It's a good, right. When you go to these publishers you're talking about, you go and there's like multiple editions, like multiple fine editions. Like there's the really expensive one, and then you're like, all right, do I want that that extra juju, or am I just going to sit on the $200 copy, which is just really awesome, And what's funny is that when you start thinking about like all that detail that you're describing, where the incredible amount of care and detail and decisions and decisiveness and craft and intention that are going to all of these elements, it mirrors a much larger kind of desire that you see all over the hipster world, to put it in crude terms, which is, for the bespoke, the fetish, the artisanal, the handcrafted, the local. And it's part of this broader desire for something really tangible and not industrial and not digital. It's almost like the esoteric parallel of these other kinds of worlds. So it's like similar, but it's also still incredibly powerful and bizarre for most people thinking about the idea that a book could have this kind of power.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think about that when you related it to hipster and the boutique this and the artisan that. That's actually quite funny since I'm in Portland, because this town's full of that. But yeah, I do agree. I mean, it is easy to just kind of brush all this off as a lot of fluff or a lot of BS, unless you've actually had an experience with that. And I'm not saying that Mark's books are any better than Peter's and Alkistis's from Scarlet Imprint, or Ben Fernie's at Society of Esoteric Endeavor, or any of these others. It's just that I think it's interesting that he actually will come out and say, this is what I do, and this is how I do it. And whereas, maybe some other publishers, they'll hint at it, and maybe we'll keep some secrets to themselves, which I think is probably a good idea as well. So maybe they don't get judged in any sense that, well, this guy is making ink with his own blood, I don't want to have anything to do with this. This just sounds dark. And sure it is. Who cares if it's light or dark? I mean, it's gray at the best, and all these books have their little dark side. I mean, it's part of the charm, But you also mentioned that there's this edition and there's that edition. the deluxe edition, the super deluxe edition, the book that will fly if you pay for it. There's so many options now, and I'm not against any of it because I'm a bookseller. I like to get these books. I like to know about them. I have to know about them if people are going to ask me about them. So it's a fascinating thing, and it's like I said, I don't think it's going to change. I think it's going to just get better and better in a lot of ways. But, at the same time, there's still a lot of stuff that comes out that's published that just seems to be dark for dark's sake, to where, extra special Luciferian Satanism or this and that, the left-hand path, way left hand. I mean, it's just like, this one's darker than the last one you read, so you want this one. And look at the cover on this. It's beautiful. And so there's just so much going on that, you can only take so much. But there are some collectors who will, I want it all. I got to have this. I got to have that. I have to have every edition, or I just have to have the only deluxe edition or the super talismanic edition. So it's kind of an interesting time to be involved as a bookseller. I don't call myself a collector anymore because I can't collect because I'm a bookseller. If I collect, I won't have anything to sell. So my current inventory at any given time is my temporary collection. And it works okay because I can still spend time with these books before they move on to where they're supposed to go. But it's just a fascinating field right now, and I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. And it's regardless of the internet, people are making good books that are going to last a long time, and some of them might have a little special power to them. So
yeah. Well, what I like about what you're saying is that it also tells me something about how you approach the whole question of magic or mysticism or this sort of otherworldliness, where it's like, it's to kind of, buy the story, this guy's version and that version is kind of a sucker's game. But on the other side, there are your experiences and there's just peculiar things that happen. And those peculiarities kind of lead you further on. And then, so for me, I mean, not to try to move it into music, but for me, your Sun City Girls cassettes back in the day were like that. I was like, who made this? What world does this come from? What mind states were behind the creation of this incendiary, bizarre, exotic item that I'm getting just in this humble cassette case with a Xerox cover? And so I think that we leave sort of objects, or we create objects that then go out and have their own kind of enchanted relationships with other people. And it's really part of the magic of books is these exchanges or transmissions you can get opening a book to any page, and it says just what you want. Like a tarot deck is a book. A tarot deck is a unbound book that you read in different orders, and those readings can be experientially incredibly profound.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an interesting segue there. I mean, it doesn't have to be books. It can be anything. It could be a piece of music. It could be a statue. You just never know. The idea is to, like, in relation to those cassettes you mentioned, which I haven't listened to in many years. I can't even remember the crazy stuff that's on half of those. But it's the same idea. This is something that's produced. It's going to have an effect on somebody. It'll have different effect on different people. You get it out there. People will get it somehow, and then it's in their court. Then they react and they engage with it. It's the same thing with a book. But it's not going to do anything unless you do engage with it. So in the case of the book, you have, if it's a deluxe and talismanic book, whatever, you have to work with it. You have to absorb it. You have to engage with it. Otherwise, it's just going to, in most cases, just going to sit there. It's not going to do anything. And that's fine with a lot of people. Same thing with a record or a cassette or whatever it is. even a CD. If you don't listen to it, you don't engage with it, it's just going to sit there. There's nothing to it otherwise. So that's just how it is. And I'm glad that you have some of those cassettes, because I wish I had some back. I could probably sell them for a lot of money. But
yeah, that's true. You know, I wanted to ask you about another set of materials on your site, which is in a way the opposite direction of Talismanic, you know, fine quality books, which is the ephemera. And, you know, as I mentioned, like one of the things that marked Sun City Girls records and the videos and all the stuff you did is this real love of intense imagery, of exotic imagery, of sort of erotica, of mysticism, occultism, devils, strange gods, tribal fetishes, et cetera, that was always very much a part of the vibe. And I see, you know, in a way you're carrying that forward with some really wonderful things, including all of these great vintage sheet music collections that have these really wonderful Masonic, Buddhist, weird Egypto fantasy covers. So I'd like to hear a little bit about what you like about this imagery, how this imagery, you know, seems like a valuable thing to collect and think about, because it's a little bit less obvious than, you know, fine antiquarian books or modern, well-produced books.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, there's certainly a similarity. There's a relationship. I mean, for me, especially, you mentioned the sheet music. I used to have quite a collection of vintage sheet music, and I actually delved in it for a while. But I didn't care about the music, because these are all songs from the early 1900s that, you know, I don't read music, but it was the graphics. It was the imagery, and you know, it's always been that way for me. You know, if you're selling a record, you know, the better the cover, the more chance you're going to sell it. But these old sheet music images are an interesting look at the time that they were published, because most of the stuff I had or have is from the 1890s to the 1920s. Where, you know, in there you had the Egyptian revival happening. So there was this huge Oriental Egyptian thing going on, not just in sheet music. It was going on in packaging. It was going on everywhere. And some of those images have just always attracted me, because it's just, wow, look at this. Sure, it's Orientalism. Sure, you know, it's not going to be approved of by this person or that person or this group or that person. Much like the same time, during that same period, there was all this black stereotype stuff that was coming out in sheet music and in packaging and everything else like that. And that's just a symbol of what was going on at that time. It's not good, it's not bad, but it's real and it's there. So there's collectibles for that too. But I was always attracted to the Oriental stuff. You know, having been accused of being an Orientalist over the years, from record albums and things like that. But I've never cared about that. I like the art. And so I wanted to collect that and preserve it and then eventually sell it. And a lot of the things that came on our record albums or in our little ephemeral releases that we would do every now and then, it's from our archive. We have tons of this stuff that, you know, we know how to market things. You know, if you want to sell a record, you know, you're going to sell it a little more quickly if you put a naked woman on the cover. I mean, that's just how it is. Or you know, a classic image of devils or demons. You know, it has to be something that people are going to go to. They have to see it. Otherwise, again, it's like a book that you never open. So these images that I decided to sell a little bit, you know, I think they're just interesting art pieces, regardless of what they meant when they came out. And some of these are almost 100 years old or older than 100 years old. So it's stuff that wasn't meant to last to begin with. So it's just a way of preserving specific art forms and paper. And my job now is to get it to the right hands if anybody wants it. I recommend people look at the stuff, and the more you see of it, the more you realize how much there actually was. then it just becomes more amazing because there are thousands and thousands of things like this. So that's all there is to it. There's nothing more to it than that, really.
Well, one of the things I like about that material, I mean, I'm also kind of a fan of Orientalism as an art movement and as an aesthetic and as a kind of record of a very romantic and in some ways misguided but still very rich encounter between Europe and the Middle East, predominantly. But what is one of the things I like about it is this, again, it's this atmosphere, it's this intangible, like a wonderful fantasy story from Lord Dunsany, or like a strange esoteric book or a scholar's book or something. Sometimes just the right object, opens up this sort of enchantment, this sense of imagination. And I think that as I said at the beginning of the show, that this also applies to a lot of your music, in the sense that, partly because you're using Middle Eastern scales or whatever. You're not playing in a standard, blues scale or whatever that has a kind of exotica quality. But more than that, a lot of your work seems to really, you invest a lot in creating an aesthetic atmosphere that has that sense. Maybe it's a little bit not appropriate on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's full of this kind of enchantment that just going through the moves of the scale is not going to create. There's a kind of investment in an invoking sense, an atmospheric sense that I also hear that you're doing in your music.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I think, even going back 20 or more years, I think I've always done that. But especially when I'm playing solo, it's just a guitar and I'm not singing. So it's instrumental. So there's no words to create a story or anything like that. So it has to be, as you say, atmospheric. It has to create a sense of place or a sense of feeling, because there's no words to indicate that for the listener. And it also helps me when I do that and I do it consciously. I mean, I do want to create that feeling, that atmosphere, whether I'm playing a Middle Eastern typed song or a raga, a version of a raga or an interpretation. That's the idea, because that's what got me interested into the music, into that type of music anyway. So if I listen to a raga, recorded whenever, it's the same thing. That puts me in a place. That certainly puts me in a mindset, and I want to do the same thing when I do that. It's not going to be traditional in the sense of following any rules of raga or proper scales. I mean, I don't know anything about scales, and I'm not really conscious of that when I'm playing. I kind of know what notes work and what don't, but I don't know if it's a Mixolydian or a Nickelodeon scale. I don't know any of this stuff. But the idea is the same. It's like you want to put the listener in a place where they can create their own story or their own visuals by just listening to what's going on in the room or on record, and that's kind of a mystical little approach. It's I'm not trying to work any magic or anything like that, but sometimes that happens. Sometimes things will happen, and a lot of it for me is based on, it's improvising. I'm not really, doing the same kind of exact thing every time, and that's because, when I do that, especially playing live, it depends on the room. It depends on the energy in the room and who's in the room, the type of room, and how many cigarettes I have left. I mean, anything could factor into to the atmosphere of what I'm trying to do. So it's kind of a fun game.
Yeah, and it comes through. I mean, I was thinking a lot about improvisation when you were talking.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're about to go on a tour, right?
I am going on tour. I'm going to have to close down the website for about a month, the book website. In the entire month of May, I'll be out touring the States and playing some shows and, of course, looking for books on every opportunity. And I'm looking forward to that because I haven't done that in a couple years. The last 2 years I've been completely focused on selling books, and I will continue to do that. But in order for me to do a tour, I can't. I'm a one-man operation on both fronts, so I'll have to put the books on hold and then come back with hopefully a bunch of new arrivals. But at the same time, I'm going to really be concentrating on the music, which I haven't done for a while. And I'm certainly looking forward to that, and I'm hoping I run into you maybe in the Bay Area.
Yeah, I might be here. I might be down in L.A. the Thursday you're playing. So one way or the other, I'll definitely be able to see you play, which is always an enchantment. Maybe we can sneak off and get some books. When you go book shopping, we got a minute here to sort of say the last thing.
Mm-hmm.
What are you looking for? What is it that is it just something you hadn't seen before? Do you have a big list that you want to fill? Do you have a sense of what your audience is?
Well, the first thing I'm looking for is an actual open bookstore that has good books, and those are hard to find now. So yeah. I don't really go looking unless it's a occult store. I know what to look for, but if it's I want to go to an antiquarian store that has old books that are good, whether they're occult or not, and I want to see stuff that I haven't seen, that I can't see online, and it's becoming harder and harder. But that's what I want to do. I don't want to go in every just used bookstore because half the time it's a waste of time. So yeah. I'm pretty particular.
Well, it's good, and it comes through the website when people want to check it out. Of course, go to richardbishopbookseller.com, and you can plunge through the wares. We got to wrap it up there. So, Richard, thanks so much for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Thanks, Eric, for having me, and hope to see you soon.
Yeah. Good luck with your tour. Okay, for me and all you out there, keep your minds open.